Jesus of Nazareth, man who lived 2,000 years ago, but we still remember his story. He taught the people about God. It said that he performed incredible miracles, so large crowds began to follow him. But much of what he taught and did began to challenge the religious and political power structure of his time. So he was, of course, eventually arrested and ultimately brought before the Sanhedrin, and Caiaphas, the high priest, asked him a direct question. He said, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus answered, "I am." He was charged with blasphemy, sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate, crucified, and buried in a tomb. All of these facts are virtually undisputed by any serious biblical scholars or historians. Today, we're going to be looking at most closely is what happened next. Because if Jesus did, in fact, rise from the dead, then this proved what he said he was, the Son of God. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Don Larose, and I'm a deacon in the Archdiocese of Boston. And I'm excited to present to you today the evidence that Jesus rising from the dead isn't some ancient myth, but an actual, well-documented historical fact. It really happened. But have you ever wondered, well, how do we know? How do we know that Jesus did the miracles that are described in the Bible? And especially, how do we know that he rose from the dead? Where does the information come from? And very importantly, is it credible? And that brings us to also the question of miracles. To believe that Jesus rose from the dead, we have to believe in miracles. So are miracles possible, or are they just fantasy and foolishness? Today we're going to be looking at some scientific evidence that makes the case that God does truly exist, and therefore that miracles are possible. Then we're going to look closely at the sources of our evidence for Jesus' resurrection, the Bible, obviously a big one. But is it credible? One thing you won't hear me say today is, well, it's in the Bible, so therefore it must be true. Now the question is, why should we believe it? We'll also look at some other evidence that's from outside of the Bible. Is there information outside the Bible that mentions Jesus, that backs up some of the stories in the Bible, or is it contradicted? And then lastly, we're going to look at several key arguments that are based on the evidence that allow us to use our reasoning and judgment abilities to determine what is the most likely truth. As we look at this evidence, we're going to address a number of common myths, misunderstandings, and fallacies that impact our understanding of the evidence, such as that the people of the ancient world, well, they were primitive and unsophisticated, and therefore they were gullible, easily fooled. Anything they didn't understand, they attributed to a miracle. Or that the writings of the Bible were passed along verbally for many generations before finally being written down some hundreds of years later. That would obviously create a lot of room for creative editing and made up stories about miracles to be inserted into the writings. Or if you either read the book or saw the movie The Da Vinci Code, which I had a great book, an interesting movie. Love Tom Hanks, of course. But the character Lee, the older gentleman, he says at one point, he says, that Jesus was not considered to be divine by his followers until the year 325, when at the Council of Nicaea, they voted and said Jesus is God. And then the female lead, Sophie, she says, "You mean they didn't think Jesus was the Son of God?" And Lee says, "Not even a cousin twice removed." So you may remember that line, funny line, but that's totally incorrect, and I'll show you the evidence. So we're going to address all these things and a lot more. Well, let's kick things off by addressing that first misperception, and that is that the people in Jesus' time were very unsophisticated, uneducated. They weren't very smart. They didn't have iPhones, right? How smart can you be if you don't have an iPhone? And so when they didn't understand something, they just considered it a miracle, and that's where the stories from miracles in the Bible came from. Well, I'll submit to you that the people living in Jesus' time were every bit as intelligent as any of us here. Now, they didn't have all the same technologies that we have, but it took us 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge to get to the place where we have iPhones and rockets and TVs and so on. But in terms of their intelligence, every bit as smart. Let me give you some examples. Perhaps three of the most highly regarded philosophers to ever live, Socrates and his student Plato and his student Aristotle, they lived between 450 and 320 years before Jesus. Yet what they thought about, what they studied, and what they wrote are still studied in today's best universities. Even before that, around 500 BC, 500 years before Jesus, lived a man who is often credited with something that all of us studied in geometry class and still do today, the Pythagorean theorem. Many of you probably remember what that was about. If you have a triangle with a 90-degree angle and you know the length of two sides, his calculation would tell you what the length of that third side is. You might even remember the calculation. It's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And again, that was 500 years before Jesus. Even long before that, archaeologists have found a 3,700-year-old clay tablet that proves that the Babylonians, up in what is today Iraq, developed trigonometry some 1,700 years before Jesus. And they did it all without computers and without calculators. So yes, people living in Jesus' time could be very intelligent, even long before Jesus. But how sophisticated were they? I mean, did they all live in like little mud huts? And they hadn't quite figured out the wheel yet, so they had to walk everywhere and so on, like you see in some kind of the older movies. Well, no. This is a model of what Rome looked like in Jesus' time. Major metropolitan area. Had 1 million people that lived in Rome. That would be very similar to many of America's good-sized cities. It looks like Philadelphia to me. This is a model of an actual apartment building in Rome. Looks like Brookline. Doesn't have electricity, but they had running water and they had flushing toilets in Rome in Jesus' time. How about outside of Rome? This is a model of ancient Carthage in North Africa, what is now Tunisia. This is Rome's biggest adversary. They battled the Romans. The Carthaginians battled the Romans regularly. They built this very sophisticated protected harbor that could hold over 200 ships. And not little, again, a lot of movies about Jesus and so on, you see them on these little tiny sailboats. 200 ships. There's a story in the Acts of the Apostles that Luke writes about a trip that Paul takes, and he's shipwrecked. And in that shipwreck, there's 275 people on that boat with Paul. This harbor could hold over 200 ships of that size and that caliber. The Romans destroyed this 150 years before Jesus came. But if you Google it, you'll still see remnants of it today. How about Jerusalem, where much of our story takes place? This is a physical, three-dimensional model, actually, of Jerusalem in Jesus' day. You can see the people's legs up there at the top of the screen. Jerusalem had about 100,000 people that lived in it year-round, but it could swell to over 1 million people on the major festivals like Passover. That large rectangular structure in the back there is the beloved and famed temple. To give you a sense of scale, that wall on the right-hand side is 10 stories high. So think about a 10-story building in Boston, very large. This is another view of Jerusalem from the other side, looking over the other side of the temple. Again, now the flat part of the temple, the plaza area, is where sacrifices were made. People exchanged money to buy doves and things to be sacrificed and so on. To give you a sense of scale again, that flat part on top is the size of 6 football fields. The man who built that, King Herod, this is his palace in Jerusalem. Beautiful, very sophisticated. King Herod was considered to be a more sophisticated builder than the Romans were. The reason we're talking about these things is to talk about miracles. Were the people in Jesus' time unsophisticated, unintelligent, easily fooled? The people in Jesus' time would not be any more easily fooled than you or I if we were present for the same events they were at. So imagine you're at where Jesus turned water into wine just by blessing it, or healed a man who'd been crippled for 38 years just by touching him. If we were at those same events, we would have said the same thing they did. It's unexplainable, aka a miracle. Obviously, Jesus rising from the dead would be the most incredible miracle of all. In these modern times, I think it'd be pretty common to hear somebody say, look, I don't believe in miracles because I'm a person of science. I need facts, I need information, I need evidence, not a lot of mumbo jumbo. But did you know that the scientific objection to miracles being possible, whether they can actually happen, goes back centuries? Famous Scottish skeptic David Hume wrote in 1748 that miracles are a violation of natural law. Miracles can't happen because they violate natural law. So Jesus couldn't walk on water because gravity would have pulled him down. Can't violate that natural law. What's important to understand about natural laws is that natural laws describe our description of the natural pattern of nature, the things we observe happening. The natural laws don't determine what happens. Let me give you an example. So if I'm standing here with an apple, and I drop the apple, the law of gravity says it's going to do what? It's going to fall and hit the ground. However, if one of you were sitting close enough by and could reach out and grab that apple before it hit the ground, Did you violate the law of natural gravity? No. You just temporarily intervened in the result. In fact, you depended on gravity to bring it down to your hand. The point is here is that if there's a being, a God, a creator, who could create the entire universe, all the planets, all the stars, all the laws, including our world, you and I, right down to every last molecule, if there's a being that powerful, he or she could easily temporarily intervene in various events in human history. It wouldn't be a problem. In fact, the miracles as described in the Bible would be child's play for such a being. So if a God like that exists, then miracles are obviously possible. And not only possible, but probable. But then that begs the question, is there any scientific evidence that a being like that exists, that there's a God that exists? Well, yes. Interestingly, there is scientific evidence that shows that God does truly exist. Did you know that nearly all scientists today already do believe in something that's supernatural, something that's outside of nature? And that is, almost all scientists believe in the Big Bang, that the Big Bang created our universe. Now, the Big Bang theory says that about 14 billion years ago, everything that exists, everything started from nothing. Nothing existed at all. But some single cause sparked all of time, space, and matter into being. Science tells us that everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. And the question is, what caused it? Albert Einstein, widely considered around the world to be the greatest scientist of all time. He described himself as a religious non-believer, said he didn't believe in God. So he became troubled in 1916 when his theories of general relativity meant that the universe was not eternal. The universe wasn't always there. It had a beginning. So he went and spent time in 1929 with Edwin Hubble, the creator of the modern telescope. And it confirmed what his theory predicted, that the universe was expanding outward from some central point. That discovery irritated Einstein. He said because it was counter to his philosophy about God. Albert Einstein, the world's greatest scientist ever lived, went on to believe that our universe was created by some kind of an intelligent being. Now there's another proof of God's existence that utilizes science and math. It's sometimes called the intelligent design theory because it says that every design had a designer. The universe has a highly complex design, and therefore the universe had a designer. The father of modern science, Sir Isaac Newton, he's credited with discovering the law of gravity, but many other laws of physics and mathematical calculus. Super smart guy. He wrote in the 1700s that this most beautiful system of the sun, the planets, and the comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And Sir Isaac Newton, again, is the person we call the father of modern science. You see that scientists are now finding that our universe in which we live has been specifically tweaked to enable life on Earth. Some of the variables that have to be perfect for human life to exist on Earth include things like the oxygen level. If there's too much oxygen in the atmosphere, fires would spontaneously erupt and everything would be fried. If there's not enough oxygen, we all suffocate. It has to be just right for us to live. The carbon dioxide level is the same. The moon, the Earth gravitational interaction, gravity. There's over 100 of these very narrowly defined constants that all are required for human life to exist, and they point to some kind of an intelligent designer. Astrophysicist Hugh Ross, he calculated what would be the probability of these, and there's actually 122 of these constants in all. What would be the chances of all of these things existing in our universe for any single planet by chance? He said it would be 0.1 with 22 zeros behind it. In other words, scientists have been recognizing that the odds of our world just randomly developing in the way it has in order to support our life are astronomical. As Nobel laureate Arno Penzias put it, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which is created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural design. So many of the world's greatest scientists did and do believe in God's existence. We mentioned Albert Einstein, but here's some of the other top scientists that we know believing in God, Sir Francis Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Pascal, Planck, and those are just the ones that fit on a slide. Some of the greatest scientists and greatest thinkers of our time, they recognize that belief in a creator and in scientific methods are not incompatible. We can believe in God and in the importance of science at the same time. These men would say that God created us and gave us the ability to think, to study, to understand, to learn. In other words, God invented and created science.